All right, so we have our first logical element, right? We have something that allows the user to see the data, right? So again, we break things up into components, right? The very first thing you should consider is what is going to get the data for you or what is going to display the data for you. And in a web application, that is always going to be some type of HTML, right? So in our case, we wanted to display data. So we took our page and we created a placeholder because we knew we had to display the data at a later date. We did not know the data to be displayed up front. We needed to display it at a later date. So we put a placeholder in our code, which was essentially just divs with class names, right? Right, so now we need something, or we need to think about what we're going to do or how we're going to get data to that page. All right, so the requirements for this application, Coffee Run, is that the user be able to create an order, see that order, and if they want to remove it, just put a check mark there. All right, so what elements are involved in the user being able to see something on a page and put a check mark in it, right? So from the HTML perspective, we know we need some sort of label, right, to display what that order is. That label should have something like a description in it, right? And we know that there's an input element of type checkbox, right, that allows us to put checkboxes on the page. So we kind of have an idea of the elements that we need to get back to this page. And when we create those elements, where are we going to put them? Well, we created a div for that, so we know we want to append to that div. All right. Now, where are we going to do that at? Well, we have existing classes. We have a data store, we have a truck, we have a main, right? But we want to be modular, right? Object-oriented programming. So what we want to do is not use that existing code because this is specific to creating checklists, right? So we're going to create a separate module to handle that, all right? So whenever your code should always have a specific purpose, all right? And this, if you've been reading through the book, this form handler JS is a module for handling forms. This data store module is a module for storing data. This truck module is the module for taking orders. This main module ties them all together. So everything has a single responsibility. If you want to read some interesting stuff, go study the single responsibility principle. For those of you that are really engrossed in your field and are really interested in this, you would want to take the time to go out and read about that if you haven't heard about it yet. All right, we discuss it later on in another class. Very important topic. All right, so what we're going to use to interact with our page and create our elements on a page is a module called checklist.js, right? If I want to create a data table on the page, or if I want to create a chart on the page, I'd probably have a separate module called chart or a separate module called data table, etc., etc. All right, so we're going to include that script checklist.js on this page because this is the page that's going to use it. All right, now let's take a look at what that module looks like. Well, what do we need that module to do? All right, well, what we want that module to do is allow us to add checklists to our div or to our placeholder that we created earlier. All right, so we're going to think of a checklist sort of like a table that contains rows. All right, that's a good idea. A checklist is a table that contains row, and each row represents an order. All right, so we're going to create a module that does that for us. All right, now this module syntax at this point should be familiar to you. What do we call this? All right, this is the module pattern, right? This isolates all the code. All these variables are isolated inside of this immediately invoked function, meaning none of it is visible to the global scope unless we explicitly export it and make it available, right? All right, so we should be familiar with this syntax where we pass in the actual window object to which we're going to attach our module code that we want to expose and make visible. All right, so let's take a look at this module. All right, the first thing we want to do is we want to get access to our app, right? So we've seen this code before. If the app exists attached to the window object, then we're going to store it in our local variable. If it doesn't, then we're going to create an empty object to store it. All right. Now we have some different code here. We're importing something called jQuery. All right, and you're going to see that later on in this module. But jQuery is a library that makes interacting with the DOM easier for us. All right, so we're going to use this library now. All right, so why do we see this window jQuery? Well, when we include scripts into our page, they get attached to the window object as well. So we're going to include this jQuery script, attach it to the window object. All right. Now, all we're doing is creating a variable called $. $sign does what? Point to this window.jQuery library. This is just a shortcut. This is still just a variable name, right? Nothing says a variable name can't be a symbol. But instead of writing document.getElement by ID, etc., we can just use this $sign. All right. We're going to see that shortly. All right, so this is a very important line here. Now let's go back to the index.html page and how we make that jQuery library available. Here we are. This is our import for the jQuery library. All right, we've imported it on our page, and it's our very first import. Okay. Now let's go back to checklist now. All right, so here's our constructor function. All right, so we have a constructor function called checklist, and it takes a selector. All right, well, what's a selector? Well, we should remember from our CSS class that a selector is something that allows us to select DOM elements, right, based on the CSS selector value. All right, so nothing new here. That's already been known. All right, so here we're doing some error handling. We just want to check that the selector exists. So we say if not selector. So we're checking that we actually have a value in that selector, right? If we don't have a value in there, we want to throw a new error immediately. Hey, there's a problem here. You haven't given me a selector, so I can't go any further. All right. Now, this code, line 12. Here we're taking advantage of our jQuery. Remember, we imported jQuery here. All right, so jQuery is sitting right here. So instead of saying to get an element, we've done this to get an element. We've done it two ways. We've done document.getElement by ID. And we give some ID, and we've done document.getElements by class name, right? Something like that. We've done document.getElements, and you see by name, by tag name, by tag. So lots of different ways to get the elements. All right, so now instead of typing that out every time, we're gonna ask the jQuery library to do it for us. So that document.getElement ID is the equivalent of this. All right, this is basically giving us document.getElement by ID for free. And we're going to give it the selector that we want. All right, so that's going to retrieve the actual element that we want from the DOM, and we're going to store it in an instance variable called this $element. All right, now of course we need to make sure that that element existed on the page, right? If that element doesn't exist on the page, then we have a problem. All right, so we want to make sure that we check that first. So what we're checking here is to make sure that the length of the element is greater than 0. Or excuse me, that the if the element's length is equal to 0, meaning there's nothing in it, then we'll throw a new element, could not find the element with that selector. All right, so all our checklist does is take in a selector, and it grabs that element using jQuery and checks to make sure that that element actually exists. So that is our constructor function for our checklist. All right, so we need 3 basic methods to make our code work. All right, so we need one method that's actually going to create the checklist item. All right, and that checklist item, we talked about the elements that we would need for that, right? We need a checkbox and some sort of text description, right? So that represents our row or our data item or our order that we're displaying back. All right, we also want a checklist to remove an element from a page, right? So that means our checklist should probably have some function available to people to call to remove a row from our table or remove an order from our list, right? And then finally, we need some sort of method to know when something is occurring so we can respond to it, right? Gotta remember, the link to JS and HTML is always going to be some sort of event, right? Whether it's a mouse click, a form submit, a rollover, a mouse over, you always link your JS to your page based on some event. When something happens in HTML, you want to respond to it with JS. All right, so we'll start with our first method, which is going to be creating the row. All right, so when we come back, we'll talk about how we create the row itself. All right, take care.